This is a shock, because we used to think that we didn't mate with anybody else, but using the science of DNA, we begin to realize, hey, there was a lot of mating that went back and forth between Neanderthals and humans.
Scientists just proved the modern humans were living somewhere they had absolutely no business being, 40,000 years before history says they got there. They found modern human DNA inside a Neanderthal woman who died 100,000 years ago in a cave in Siberia, at a time when, according to every textbook ever written, our species hadn't even left Africa yet. That's not a small error in the timeline. That's a timeline collapsing entirely. But the real shock isn't the gap, it's what had to happen for that DNA to get there. A group of modern humans had to exist, had to travel further than anyone thought possible, had to find Neanderthals in the mountains of Central Asia, and then vanish so completely that not one of their bones has ever been found. They left nothing behind, except us. And what they left inside us is still shaping your body today, in ways that will completely change how you see yourself by the end of this video. Scientists were in Denisova Cave in the Altai Mountains of Siberia, working on a fragment of Neanderthal woman's toe bone. Routine by paleogenetic standards. For years, researchers had been drilling into exactly these kinds of fragments, pulling ancient DNA from dust and bone, sequencing it, mapping it. What they expected? More Neanderthal genome data, confirming what they already knew. What they actually found stopped the field cold. Buried in her genome, genuinely integrated into her ancestry, not a contamination artifact, was a sequence of unmistakably modern human DNA.
Neanderthal fossils. So the idea that modern humans have Neanderthal DNA in them is incredibly important.
Not Neanderthal, not Denisovan, human. The kind of DNA that should only belong to people like us. To understand why that's a problem, you need the timeline. The accepted story of human migration runs roughly like this. Homo sapiens evolved in Africa. Around 60,000 years ago, a major group migrated out, spreading through the Middle East and into Europe and Asia. Along the way, they encountered Neanderthals. They interacted. They sometimes had children together. That's why people of non-African descent carry about 1 to 2% Neanderthal DNA today. Known fact, settled question, closed case. Except the Altai Neanderthal woman lived approximately 100,000 years ago, 40,000 years before modern humans were supposed to be anywhere near Siberia. Finding modern DNA in a Neanderthal from that period is like discovering a working circuit board inside a cave painting. It doesn't just raise a question, it undermines the foundation the question was built on. The researchers confirmed it wasn't contamination. The DNA was ancient, fragmented in exactly the way genetic material degrades over 100,000 years of burial. It was genuinely hers, part of her biological inheritance, passed down through her maternal line across generations. A real encounter, recorded in her cells long after everyone involved had turned to dust. There's a word for something that exists outside the time it belongs to. An anachronism. We usually apply that word to objects. A coin found in the wrong century, a tool that predates its supposed invention. We don't typically apply it to entire populations of people. But that's what this discovery revealed. A group of modern humans was alive and moving through Central Asia 40,000 years before history said they left Africa. No bones, no tools, no campfires, no cave art, just one quiet biological echo preserved in the genome of a woman who had nothing to do with them, except one ancestor who did. The silence is what gets me. These people were real. They had names in whatever language they spoke. They built fires. They raised children. One of those children had a child with a Neanderthal in the mountains of Siberia. And then they were gone, so completely that the only proof they ever existed is a fraction of someone else's DNA. That's not a footnote in human history. That's a chapter someone tore out. So who were they? How did a group of modern humans end up in the mountains of Central Asia 40,000 years before the migration that was supposed to bring us there? And why did they disappear without leaving a single trace? Well, the answer to that is stranger than the discovery itself. We tend to imagine the out-of-Africa migration as a single event, one massive movement of people, a great exodus, a defined moment in history when humanity left its birthplace and spread across the globe. Clean, dramatic, linear. The truth is messier. It's less of an exodus and more of a leak. Small groups dripped out of Africa over vast stretches of time, not in one wave but in dozens. Most of those groups left no lasting trace. Some reached dead ends, some were absorbed by larger populations, some simply died out. The 60,000-year migration we talk about was the one that worked, the one whose descendants are still here, but it wasn't the first attempt. The group whose DNA ended up in the Altai Neanderthal was one of the early ones. Homo sapiens, anatomically modern, the same species as us, but from a lineage that split off from the ancestors of all living known African people long before the main migration. Think of them as a cousin branch. Same family, different path. Sometime after 200,000 years ago, this group left. How many of them there were, no one can say. A few hundred, maybe a few thousand. They moved northeast, most likely tracing coastlines and river valleys through the Middle East, a journey that would have unfolded across generations. Their children were born in transit. Their grandchildren may never have known what Africa looked like. And then they turned east, deeper into Central Asia, into a world no modern human had ever entered. This was the Ice Age in full swing. Glaciers pushed down from the north. Deserts stretched south. The landscape was violent and unpredictable, and the people already living there, Neanderthals and Denisovans, had spent hundreds of thousands of years adapting to it. These newcomers hadn't. There's something almost cinematic about what must have happened when they arrived in the Altai region. Two completely different kinds of people, meeting at the edge of the known world. We can't say whether the encounter was friendly or hostile or something in between, but we know what it produced. Children, families, DNA that persisted through generations and ended up in the genome of a Neanderthal woman found in a cave in Siberia. Here's the detail that keeps pulling me back. This genetic exchange happened only here. The modern human DNA found in the Altai Neanderthal doesn't appear in Neanderthal populations from Europe or the Middle East. It was localized, a single event, or a handful of closely related events in one specific region of the world. These people didn't spread. They touched one corner of the globe, left a faint mark, and disappeared. That's not a story of conquest. That's a story of people who went as far as anyone had ever gone, made contact with the only other humans they'd ever met, and then were swallowed by a world that was simply too large and too harsh for their small numbers to survive. Their failure, by the way, doesn't say anything about their intelligence or their capability. It says something about scale. A population of a few hundred people, surrounded by tens of thousands of Neanderthals and Denisovans who'd been there for hundreds of millennia, the math was never in their favor. They were absorbed or they died out. Either way, the lineage ended, except for that one quiet echo. But they weren't alone out there, because the Altai Mountains weren't just home to Neanderthals. There was another group living in those same caves, walking the same ground, staring at the same sky, a group so mysterious that we only discovered they existed at all because of a single bone fragment. And what their DNA revealed made the ghost lineage look like a simple story. For most of modern science, the human family tree looked like an actual tree. Clean forks, distinct branches. Homo sapiens up here, Neanderthals over there, some extinct relatives somewhere below them. Separate categories, clear divisions, the kind of diagram that fits neatly on a poster in a museum. Genetics destroyed that diagram. What the DNA actually shows isn't a tree. It's a river delta. Dozens of channels that diverge, run separately for stretches, and then crash back into each other. The Altai Mountains were one of the biggest conversion points on that delta. Neanderthals from the west, Denisovans ranging across Eastern Asia, two separate waves of modern humans poking into the region at different times. All of them meeting, all of them mixing. The Denisovans deserve a moment here, because their story is one of the strangest in all of paleontology. Their entire known physical record consists of a few bone fragments and a couple of molars from a single Siberian cave. No complete skeletons, no skulls, no artifacts we can definitively link to them. They are, in the most literal sense, known almost entirely from their DNA, pulled from those tiny scraps and sequenced into a complete genome. And what that genome showed was extraordinary. The Denisovans were a distinct branch of the human family, genetically about as different from Neanderthals as Neanderthals were from us. But they weren't strangers to each other. The same cave that held Denisovan remains also held Neanderthal remains. They shared that space, walked the same ground, stared at the same Siberian sky. And then they did more than coexist. Scientists found that Denisovans carried significant chunks of Neanderthal DNA in their own genomes, the product of multiple rounds of interbreeding over long stretches of time. But the most remarkable discovery was a single bone fragment from a teenage girl who lived about 90,000 years ago. When her DNA was sequenced, researchers found that her mother was Neanderthal and her father was Denisovan, a genuine first-generation hybrid. Not a theory, not a model, not an interference. A person, a specific individual whose parents were from two different human lineages. This is not ancient history being abstract and remote. That is a family. And her Denisovan father, it turned out, had Neanderthal ancestors of his own from several generations earlier, meaning the mixing had been going on long before her birth, across multiple generations, woven into the fabric of both populations in ways that blur every clean line we ever try to draw between them. The word species stops making sense here. A species, technically, is a group that only reproduces with its own kind. These groups were reproducing with each other, repeatedly, productively, across tens of thousands of years. Whatever they weren't separate species in any meaningful biological sense. They were regional variants of the same sprawling, messy, interconnected human population. And into this already tangled web, 50,000 years ago, came another wave of us. The question is, what we actually took from them when we arrived, because it turns out the Neanderthals and Denisovans didn't just leave behind bones, they left something inside us that is still keeping people alive right now. And when they arrived, they were not ready. Not for the cold, not for the diseases, not for a continent that had been shaped by hundreds of thousands of years of ice age pressure that their bodies had never experienced. These were modern humans, the same wave whose descendants would eventually populate most of the Earth. But in that moment, stepping into Europe and Central Asia for the first time, they were the most vulnerable people on the planet. Immunologically naive, biologically unprepared, walking into a world that had been killing the weak for millennia with no inherited knowledge of how to survive it. What saved them wasn't tools. It wasn't language. It wasn't superior intelligence. It was 1 to 2%. The Neanderthal DNA now sitting in the genome of anyone with non-African ancestry. It gets mentioned at dinner parties like a novelty, a fun quirk of prehistory, a curiosity to bring up after someone mentions their ancestry test results. It isn't a curiosity, it's a survival mechanism. The Neanderthals and Denisovans had been adapting to that environment for hundreds of thousands of years. Their immune system had already fought these pathogens. Their bodies had already figured out how to process less sunlight, how to regulate at different altitudes, how to survive conditions that our African ancestors had never encountered. The genes they passed on weren't a souvenir. They were a set of tools. Specific Neanderthal gene variants boosted immune function in ways that helped early modern humans survive diseases they had no prior exposure to. Others influenced skin and hair in ways that likely aided adaptation to lower UV environments. The interbreeding wasn't romantic background noise. It was, in a very real sense, a knowledge transfer. One population teaching another how to stay alive in a new world, and passing that lesson through their children's DNA. Think about what that actually means. Our ancestors arrived in Europe cold, exposed, immunologically naive, walking into a continent full of pathogens their body had never seen. The Neanderthals had been fighting those same diseases for 200,000 years. Their immune architecture was already calibrated for that world. And when the two populations had children together, that calibration transferred, not through teaching, not through observation, through biology. The children of those encounters were better equipped to survive than either parent population alone would have been. That's not a minor detail in the human story. That is the human story. The Denisovans contributed something even more specific. There's a gene variant connected to how the body processes oxygen that today appears at high frequency in Tibetan populations, allowing them to live and work at altitudes where most people would become dangerously ill. That adaptation didn't evolve in Homo sapiens. It came directly from Denisovans, passed on through interbreeding, and preserved in populations who needed it most. That is not a footnote. That is a gift that has been keeping people alive for thousands of years. The inheritance wasn't all beneficial. That's worth saying honestly. Some Neanderthal gene variants are associated with higher risk of type 2 diabetes, certain immune disorders, and elevated responses to particular viral infections. Evolution doesn't hand out only prizes. What kept people alive in 40,000 BCE sometimes creates complications in the 21st century. The trade-off was real, and our bodies have spent millennia sorting through it. Modern medicine is, in some respects, still negotiating with decisions made in a Siberian cave 100,000 years ago. There's also evidence the exchange wasn't purely biological. Archaeological sites from the period where Neanderthal and modern human populations overlapped show tool technologies that appear to blend elements from both cultures, techniques that don't belong cleanly to either group. They weren't just trading genes. They were in, at least some places and moments, trading knowledge, watching each other work, adopting what worked. The relationship was more layered than conquest, more collaborative than competition, even if it didn't end well for the Neanderthals as a distinct people. We didn't conquer the ancient world. We didn't replace Neanderthals through sheer human superiority. We survived by absorbing what they already knew. Our ability to adapt to new environments, the thing that made Homo sapiens ultimately successful, was significantly powered by genetic material we borrowed from people we pretend went extinct. The ghost lineage, the one with no bones and no name, left its mark in a Neanderthal woman's genome. The Denisovans left a gene variant in the lungs of Tibetan farmers climbing mountains. None of them are truly gone. Which forces the question nobody in this conversation has asked yet. If they never really disappeared, if their DNA is still running through billions of people alive today, then what does that say about who we actually are? Because the answer to that question changes everything. There's a version of the human story we've been telling for a long time. We were the smart ones, the creative ones, the ones with language and art and complex tools who swept across the planet and left everyone else behind. The Neanderthals were a cautionary tale, bigger and stronger, but ultimately outcompeted, ultimately replaced, ultimately extinct. That story is not just incomplete, it's backward. Neanderthals carried our DNA 100,000 years ago, long before the main migration. We carry their DNA today. The Denisovans' genetic legacy is still keeping people alive at altitude in Tibet. There is no version of human success that isn't also a story of mixture, borrowing, and inheritance. We didn't win by being pure. We succeeded precisely because we weren't. And yet the caveman image persists. Stooped, grunting, dragging a club. Every cartoon, every Halloween costume, every casual insult, "Don't be such a Neanderthal," built on the assumption that they were the failed draft of us, the rough copy before the polished version arrived. What's strange about that image, when you actually look at the evidence, is how little it holds up. Neanderthals buried their dead. They used pigment. They crafted jewelry from eagle talons. They cared for injured members of their group. We know this because skeletons have been found with healed injuries so severe that survival would have been impossible without sustained help from others. These weren't brutes. They were people who looked after each other in conditions most of us couldn't survive for a week. The "we replaced them because we were better" story was never really about Neanderthals. It was about us, about our need to believe that success is earned through superiority rather than circumstance and luck, and in this case, a willingness to merge rather than stay separate. People spend significant money on ancestry tests, tracing their lineage back 3 or 4 generations. But anyone with non-African heritage can trace a direct genetic line to a Neanderthal ancestor. That 1 to 2% isn't a number. It represents real moments, real encounters between people who had never seen each other before, in caves and valleys and mountain passes at the edge of the known world, who made choices that rippled forward 100,000 years into your immune system and mine. Many scientists now argue that Neanderthal, Denisovan, and Homo sapiens shouldn't be treated as separate species at all. The interbreeding was too consistent, too sustained, too productive. They were more like regional variants of a single widespread human population, shaped by different environments, carrying different adaptations, but never truly closed off from one another. If that's true, then extinction isn't the right word for what happened to them. The river didn't end. It merged with ours. The channel is still running. The discovery from Siberia, that impossible modern human DNA in a Neanderthal woman who lived before our ancestors were supposed to exist, ultimately tells us something specific about what kind of species we are. We are not the result of one clean lineage succeeding where others fail. We're a composite, a mosaic, built from encounters at the edge of the world between people who had every reason to be strangers and chose, in at least some moments, not to be. Here's the observation I can't stop returning to. The trait we most pride ourselves on, adaptability, the ability to survive anywhere, in any climate, against any odds, wasn't entirely ours to begin with. We borrowed it from people we spent centuries looking down on. The thing that shouldn't have existed in that DNA wasn't alien. It wasn't impossible. It was us, 100,000 years earlier, leaving a mark we did not know would survive. And if you want to know what Neanderthals look like in the final chapter, you don't need a museum. You already carry the answer. The only question worth sitting with is this. If extinction means your DNA disappears, and theirs didn't, did they really go extinct at all?